and then I'm gonna start the webinar. Okay, let's go for it.
All right.
Good evening, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two to make sure everyone is logged in and can hear and see our presentation this evening. While we're waiting, you can feel free to introduce yourself in our chat. Tell us where you're listening in from. We'll get started in just one more minute. All right, why don't we get started? Good evening and welcome to the Milwaukee Public Library Book Chat program. Each month we focus on a different theme and invite guests from around the country, the world, and sometimes from Wisconsin too. My name is Beth. I'm the adult librarian at the Milwaukee Public Library East Branch. With me tonight is my colleague, Tanya, who is the new library services coordinator, also at the East Branch. We are so excited to share these recommendations with you and introduce you to our featured guest. Feel free to use the chat box throughout the event and drop your questions for our guests in the Q&A as we go along. We will be emailing you in a couple of days, so don't feel like you need to write down any of these book recommendations. We'll make sure you get all those titles. All right, and then without further ado, I'd like to introduce our special guest. Ria Ewing is a comic illustrator and fine artist who graduated from University of Wisconsin-Madison with a BFA in drawing and printmaking. Their creative work centers on creating connections, challenging assumptions, and the wondrous things we can learn from each other. We're so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for sharing your time. I'm going to throw it over to Tanya and Ria for a bit, and we have one more slide to go before I turn these off too. So let me do that.
Hi, everybody. This is Tanya speaking, they, them pronouns. And I just asked Beth to let this slide live with here for just a second before we kind of get into talking with Rhea. This is from their graphic novel, Fine, a comic about gender. And it's in the notes section. And this is kind of like a thought that I want us to sort of carry us into the first half of this interview. So our sense of place can deeply inform our identities and experiences. So let's just sit and think about that while we move forward. So I think, hi, there's faces.
Hello.
So before we kind of like touch on that quote that definitely really hit with me. So your new book is Fine, out this year. It's a 2022, hot off the presses. Oh, here. Yeah, you have yours blurred. Mine is just backwards. Don't be intimidated by the number of Post-it notes.
I love to see it. There were so many Post-it notes and like binders in the creation of this book that like seeing that, I'm just like, yes, I'm not alone in the Post-it note front. So
I'm really good at simulating like I'm good at doing my homework. So your notebook is called Fine, comic about gender. Can you go ahead and give us like what's your elevator pitch for this book?
it is a more than 300-page nonfiction graphic novel based off of interviews that I conducted with people all over the United States about gender and how it impacts our lives.
Perfect. So again, a lot of travel involved with this book, and we'll get into that a little more. But to start, we would love to know, and it's a frequent question in our book chats, of like, what is your Milwaukee or Wisconsin connection?
All right. My family moved to Baraboo, Wisconsin when I was 16. And if you want a surly teenager, move them like right before senior year of high school. Like I was very surly about it. And I was like, I can't believe this is happening. I'm so determined to be mad about it, but also it's really pretty here. But no, but I'm determined to be mad about this. But also like, I kind of like the way people are interacting, like that, I really like that. But no, I don't like this. And then it actually wound up being like the first place where my family lived that really felt like home to me. I fell in love with the landscape, with the various cultures here in terms of like how communication is done. And like, I felt very at home, and I still think of Wisconsin as where I'm from. So that's kind of like, that's really the heart of my connection. I went to one of the 2-year UW colleges campuses, the Baraboo-Sauk County one. And then I also went to University of Wisconsin-Madison. And then I lived in the Dane County area for a number of years before I finally moved. I did eventually move away because I got married, and then my spouse found their dream job in California. So now I live in California, but you know.
Yeah, sometimes like have dream job, will travel.
Yes. I'm like, I can work anywhere there's an internet connection. So this makes sense.
Yeah, and California in abundance, I imagine, of internet connections. So I love, we're going to go back to that little quote I pulled from the notes section of your comic, because what was fun, I had Beth, she and I were talking about like sort of how we wanted to frame our questions for this event. And one thing I kept thinking about, both with reading your comic and then doing a little bit of additional research just to see like other interviews you maybe have done, is that this is clearly something that is contingent on travel, and that you clearly went a bunch of different places to meet the folks who you interviewed throughout this book. And I found myself thinking about like that aspect of the journey and wondering about the geographies of the places you traveled to and how that may have shaped the identities of the people you were interviewing. So I was really like, I had not read the notes section yet and was so jazzed to see like the very first line of the notes section touches on that idea of like place in the sense of self. So I just was curious, like, how did you see that relationship play out throughout the process? Because when you refer to it in the notes, it's about sort of that, it's like an opening page, if it's all right for me to show, of these 3 panels that are taken from Kentucky and Wisconsin, if I understand correctly. So, and how this is kind of like how your book starts, which I thought was such an interesting beginning. And then to see your reason why with like landscape and places being so tied to our identities. So how did you see that playing out for yourself? Because this has been like a decade's worth of your life. And how did you see it reflected in the people you were interviewing?
Yeah, so for myself, I think of sense of place as kind of being of 3 primary components. One is like the land itself, like, you know, do we have lots of like woodland areas? Is this like a big prairie? Is this a super humid area where like you can go for a fun walk in the woods and come out covered in 20 ticks? Like, you know, is this a place where, you know, it's 6 months out of the year, it's like you're really snowed in and you're like, you know, turning inward a lot. You know, there's that aspect of it. There's also the sense of place in terms of like how easy it is to connect with people in person. So the town that I grew up in Kentucky was 11,000 people at the time. But we were the big town in the area because we had the Walmart. So that, I mean, that says a lot right there. So there wasn't really necessarily anywhere to go outside of the town to like connect with other people. And then the community itself like was very tight knit, which was, I think, positive in some ways. But as like a young queer person, like trying to figure myself out, it was like super negative in other ways, because it was kind of a one person knows something that everybody does. And so like, there's just a lot you don't talk about. living in Wisconsin, like I in Baraboo was about the same size when my family moved, the same size town, but way less centralized because we were less than an hour away from Madison. So suddenly, like nobody had the sense that like we were the central hub, and it was a lot easier, and the community itself kind of operated a little bit differently, but I'll get to that in a second. But it was easier to like drive around to different places and like, okay, cool, like I'm gonna go over here and like use different pronouns and like, you know, maybe dress a little differently and see how this feels, or like, you know, meet up with these people. And that is something that wasn't really available to me where I was in Kentucky. Now that would be different if I had been in a different part of Kentucky as a state. And then the third aspect of place is like the culture that, you know, we as humans bring to it. Both in terms of how we communicate with one another, and also things like our history in places. So particularly I'm thinking of, well, this really applies to every place, but I'm thinking about, for example, in Ohio, in Cincinnati and Columbus, like, you know, there's a lot of racial segregation. And just like there's a lot of racial segregation in here in Wisconsin. But because I wasn't from there, I could see it differently. You know, it's like you're a fish in water. You don't notice it until it changes. And that history of like, you know, enslavement and emancipation and the Reconstruction, and like it, you know, echoed through to the way things operate today. And that was like part of the place as much as the landscape itself. That led to some interesting things. For example, the queer community then also very segregated. And my experiences with queer community in Wisconsin, at least, is that especially in the Madison area, like the queer spaces tend to be pretty predominantly white, and there's like kind of a problem with racism in those communities, as there is everywhere, but sort of it has the unique problem of like racism in a liberal white space that is mostly white people, of like no one realizes that they're being racist. Yeah, so connecting with diverse and resilient in Milwaukee, and with some of my, yeah, I know, right? They're so cool. They're so cool. I can't
And they
believe
also
they hung
have
out
an
with me.
Appleton branch for anyone who may be interested. I can try to put a link in while Rhea continues to talk, for the diverse and resilient is the group we're talking about.
Yeah, so connecting with diverse and resilient, and also connecting with folks in, like I said, Cincinnati and Columbus, like really opened my eyes to like, okay, when you have like the segregation, you have like different subcultures or different cultures even, you know, developing, like those are all like, you know, you wind up with people using different words to describe the same thing, or using the same word to describe really different things, or one thing that is a word that's absolutely not okay to say in the trans community, let's say in Minnesota, is totally fine and is super affirming and positive to hear in Ohio. The words that I'm talking about, things like, you know, transvestite or transsexual, like, you know, things that for some people are very neutral, for some people are very positive, and for a lot of people, like, will get kind of like, whoa, like, don't say that. I found that really interesting. And for me, it was helpful coming from the relative place of isolation that I had been, both geographically and also in terms of how my temperament tends to be. I'm a little bit on the shy side. Yes. Sometimes I'm kind of the person, I'm really shy, and then I get to know you and I'm like an overwhelming golden retriever. So yes. It was really helpful for me to see that and to reflect on, like, you know, how my past experiences and the way I felt about myself, particularly when I lived in Kentucky and things were so isolating and insular, that wasn't necessarily like just me or like my fault in any way. It could also just be like, that's just where I happened to be, and like what the culture was doing. So yeah, I hope that answered some of your question.
Oh no, absolutely. I loved that you sort of broke it down into like those three, like it shows you've thought about it a lot, obviously, especially since you've like pulled it out to make mention of it in your book. But I love that you sort of like hit on all of these ways that like place shapes us, you know. And I grew up in Wisconsin, central Wisconsin. So Baraboo is very familiar to me, although we're a little further north, but it is a really beautiful part of the state. And like I talk about it all the time. Like I'm an inherent flatlander. Like I find that I'm probably one of like 5 people who really enjoys like going through Indiana because I find that landscape very satisfying. But I take trains, I don't drive. So that's probably also why.
Yes, it's easier to enjoy when you can like stretch your legs a little bit and not have to worry about deer. So
yes, those fine things. But yeah, I really appreciate because there's so many ways, especially like for myself, having grown up in Wisconsin and pretty much lived here in different places all my life. But, I've been in Milwaukee for a minute. So seeing like the difference of that, hearing you talk about Madison is really interesting because when I was a kid in a small town in Wisconsin, it was absolutely like that's what we had. That was like our cultural hub. And then now being someone who's lived in Milwaukee for so long, I have particular biases. But yeah.
For real. I grew up in Milwaukee my whole life. So I'm like,
all right.
Madison.
Yeah. So
I'm snooty.
Legitimate.
And I guess I was just a little curious. So like how long were you in Kentucky? I was just curious about your timeline.
Okay. Yeah. So my family moved to Kentucky when I was 6 and we moved away when I was 16. So 9.5, 10 years, somewhere in there. My parents' plan had been to move away sooner and then, like debt and like, it was difficult to make happen. So, but we did eventually move and it was good for everyone. So.
Oh yeah. Nice. And then I'm kind of going back to sort of like the process of your book and sort of how that, as we were reading through, there's a definite shift where you notice like there's this pivot about the first third of the book where you start to include yourself as part of the research and not just letting yourself be the researcher. Can you explain why you took that route?
Yeah, so for the majority of the time that I worked on this book, so 10 years, I really did not want to include myself in it for a few reasons. One was that, and I still hold to this reason, which is that I think I'm not necessarily the most interesting person to be talking about myself when it comes to gender. Within the trans and queer community, I hold a tremendous amount of privilege, right? I'm white, I'm relatively neurotypical, I think. I don't have any like physical disabilities. I was assigned female at birth. So, when I play with my gender, like that tends to be more accepted by most folks than if I was assigned male at birth or being read as male. So like I have a lot of like stuff that makes my life easier. I also have parents who love me and accept me and let me live in their basement for years while I worked on this book. Like that's a lot. I've like had enough to like self-fund this project when I couldn't get any grants to help me. Like that's a lot of privileges. And so like I'm super cognizant of that. So that was like my biggest reason for like, I don't want to be the center of this. I don't want to make a book that's like another like white assigned female at birth non-binary persons. This is our story. Like that's great. That should happen. I don't know if I don't want to make that book. But then I connected with my agent Anjali Singh, and she really, really, really pushed me to include myself in the book. And what won me over was one, she pointed out that it would just narratively make the book stronger, like having that through line of like what connects all of these disparate people. It is kind of interesting, like what drives a person to spend 10 years making a comic book about like all of these interviews. And it's also important for the reader to know who I am and what my experiences are. So that, because I'm not an objective, like unbiased observer, like bringing like like I'm not, like I have the stuff that I care about, and and you can see it in the book, like which interview questions I really leaned into and which ones like I wasn't like really capable at the time of like digging into so much. Like I want my readers to be aware of that, and then to like think about like what would this book look like, or what would these conversations look like with a different interviewer, and like I really hope that like at least some of my readers are like, what would these interviews look like if I was the interviewer, you know, if the reader was like, so that these conversations can keep happening. So the other thing is that I was called out on my not wanting to be vulnerable, because, you know, you spend 10 years, more than that, quietly not talking about yourself or sharing anything outside of the norm when it comes to your experiences and who you are because of fear. That's really difficult. So it took a lot of work for me to include myself in the book and to be vulnerable about things like, this is how I felt when puberty happened, and like this is why like I didn't connect or come out, connect with the queer community really, or come out until after college, even though I had all of this support. Like, you know, it was difficult for me to talk about those things, and also I'm really glad that I did, because there are people who have those exact same experiences who can like know that they are not alone in that, and that we share that space. And you know, I think this is mentioned in the chapter in the book about race, but I do also think that there is a cultural desire that I had to kind of be like the white, detached, like observer, which in hindsight, I'm like, okay, well, that doesn't work for all the mentions all the things that I already mentioned, but the thing that was appealing to me about that was that sense of like control or like distance, or like I could like have this fixed thing and then be like, look, I am legitimate, this is who I am, no one can ever question me or tell me I'm in the wrong place ever again. And that's not realistic. That's not how gender works. That's not how life works. What is more important is that we all connect with each other, that we are capable of being vulnerable, and think about how we can construct things differently to include more people. So
yeah, absolutely.
I really got that. I don't want to spoil the book, but like the last page is my favorite.
Aww.
Because you really pulled what you just said all together, and it was like this masterful thesis that you built, you know. And I'm a historian by trade, by education, and like this really worked for me on that level, because you did, you know, cite your sources, you had your interviews, and I was like, man, if only I could draw, you know, because, you know, we historians interview people much like you have done, you know, sociologists done, and like the way you're able to capture all of that work was like facial expressions and like body language, and it was just really effective. And I'm glad you were encouraged to bring yourself into that narrative, because it did carry it through until your conclusion. So it was really great. And then I was like, oh, there's notes in the back. And I got really excited. So thank you for including that.
Yes, notes.
I love little like notes. I read the book last night at the Telegraph Club, which is a YA book, won an award last year, all that fun stuff. And when I found out that it had a bibliography, so bibliography is at the end of a YA novel.
Beautiful,
as they say. So one thing I want to a couple of questions to sort of like wrap up this like discussion about the book, and then we've got a few more questions we can kind of touch on, and then of course we can get to all of our recommendations, which I'm excited to hear each of us talk about. But I had a chance to watch the short little interview you did for the Raw Madison, like it was 2012, so really around the time you were starting this project.
Yeah.
And you were discussing your art that was on display at that time. It sounded like a mix of like digital art and fine art as well. And one thing you discussed was how it sounds like you had started kind of in the sciences, and then you, even though you've always had an interest in drawing, and then at some point you sort of like changed over into wanting to focus on art. But the thing I loved was hearing you talk about how you continue to see a connection and relationship between art and science. And I was just curious, like, how have you brought that into your process, which I feel like you were kind of touching on a little bit when you were discussing like that initial approach you wanted to take with this project, where you're like, you get to keep yourself at a distance. It's very much, like you said, the white anthropologist sort of approach, like, or if you were a white documentarian, you're like, a true documentarian is completely hands-off, like unbiased, no commentary, and like objective is like that big thing. So I hearing you discuss that, and then thinking about like this past relationship of thinking about like science and art, where is that relationship for you now? And is that maybe like instinctual scientific approach part of like what got this project started? And did you carry that out throughout the whole process?
Oh my goodness. All right. There's a couple of pieces that I want to dig into here. I want to start with objectivity. And that's something that like you brought up like instinct, like that's something that I was like in the idea of like being capable of being objective to that way about my own culture and own like something that I was experiencing on a very real level. Like that idea like was very like honed into me as like, this is possible, this is achievable, this is desirable. And it's so funny to me because like my fine arts work has for years since before I started this book been in part about how in science, studying the natural world, like looking at things that are not human, we fail to be objective over and over again. One of my favorite books is called Evolution's Rainbow. And it's about different, sorry, I'm just gonna like go off the rails. Here's a book recommendation right off.
Do it. Yes. Yes.
It's called Evolution's Rainbow. It is a delight. It's by a trans woman who's also like has a doctorate in biology, and like she is incredible. And she goes through all of these different cases of like animal behavior and how it's been documented and how people have talked about it, and pointing out that maybe some of our cultural biases about how like gender and relationships should work are like really impacting the way we look at and understand these species, and that, you know, we're hindered, you know, transphobia and homophobia like actively hinder and get in the way of our ability to see the world for what it is. So that absolutely recommend that one. But you know, that core idea has like been central to my work, and I think is part of what drove me to decide to pursue art instead of science, because I realized that with art I could, you know, learn about all kinds of different things. For one, if you're a scientist, you tend to get, you know, it's a very focused track. Married to a scientist, so it's kind of fun to like think about our differences, where I'm like, I learned about 50 different random things today, and you know, my spouse will be like, cool, I know so much about this really, really specific thing. My spouse also knows a whole lot about a whole bunch of other stuff, but you know, that's just because they're awesome, not because he's a scientist. So okay, sorry, I talk about my spouse going on. I'm like,
oh yes.
Okay, so I wanted to be able to like, you know, look at a wider variety of topics than if I was like a scientist studying something really specific. And two, I was really interested in this idea of like, you know, I see all of these connections between like, why do I care so much about like prairie habitats? Like, I actually think it's because like, well, I read about all of these different species like interacting with one another and supporting one another and being essential to one another. And that really resonates for me in how I'm trying to like understand and connect with the human beings around me and figure out how community works as a young person, right? So art allows me to not only like look at the world around me and like celebrate all of these things, but to also bring in like all of these other ideas and like show the connections between them, and like not just like try to be objective and get rid of those connections, but like really revel in them. So like it's kind of what drew me to art in the first place. And then within the context of the book, that shift from, it's like I had to relearn the lesson, right? Like, you know, and shift from I can be this objective scientific anthropologist documentarian, no problem, to going, wait a second, like I'm in this. This is about connections and like something we're actively building all of the time. So that's that piece, the objective piece.
Yes.
With regards to like how I sit with that now in my work, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk about like, this is so early stages. This is not me like promoting myself. This is like, you know, we're still in the like, I'm writing outlines and rewriting outlines kind of a thing. But the book that I'm working on next,
yes,
is
exclusive. Right, everybody.
It is a fictional book. I wanted to do fiction instead of nonfiction this round because I got a little burnt out with all of the just the logistics of like maintaining connections and like going back and forth with all of my interviewees. Like there's a lot of logistics there, and I wanted to take like a little pause from that. So we're going fiction, young adult, and it is about a small group of transgender teenagers in Michigan saving a rare prairie fen habitat from development. So we have queerness, we have gender, we have the natural world, and like being able to appreciate like landscape and a sense of place, and all of those things like really connected and as one. And for the main character, like a lot of her journey is, you know, seeing herself in her interests and in science and in the natural world. So, you know, a little bit of put in a little bit of myself in that, but I'm really excited about it. And I think that, you know, now these things I think come much more cohesively to me. And I also think that like our cultural conversation about like science and objectivity has changed a lot. So for example, in the book, Breeding Sweetgrass is incredibly popular and it's incredibly good. And like that philosophy.
They're making a YA version. Like they've been doing that with a lot of, you know, all sorts of like really crucial books. They're like making it so it's like it can be as accessible as possible to perhaps like a slightly younger audience. So anyway,
that's really exciting. Okay, all right, fantastic. Another book recommendation. Boom. Yeah. So I think more people have this awareness of like, how do we relate to the land around us? How can we engage in not only observation and understanding of the world, like through like, you know, science, but also like, what do we do with that information and how do we decide which questions to ask? And those two sides of like the scientific process are like where I think a lot of magic happens. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think
so exciting. Sorry.
Yes, let's celebrate your outlining stage because that's still something and exciting. I love how that sounds. And my current position before I head over to where Beth is working is like I'm a teen librarian. So I always love to hear about that. Especially with like LGBTQ plus representation, like huge. I think all the time about the kind of books, the options of books I had when I came out, when I was like 14, which would have been like early 2000s, and versus now, it's very exciting. And just like touching on really quickly with like science and that relationship of objectivity, I think also like thinking about this also as a non-binary person, and when I'm like thinking about like I was thinking about this today as I was like coming home to prepare for this. I was like remembering the journey of like trying to figure out if I like qualified to be non-binary.
Oh, that's so real. That's so real.
And like my go-to if it's not obvious with my profession, I guess, is like Googling things, and it's let's see, like, how do I know? And I think especially when you're coming into like this, you're trying to find something out, which is obviously a very scientific relationship, but also like a very much an artistic relationship. We just construct things to like figure things out for ourselves instead of, bullet journaling. We make decade-long projects.
Yeah, totally, like one does.
Yes, exactly. I relate deeply to your inclinations. And I think about how when I was trying to like parse out my gender, it felt as though I needed to have like my arguments ready. And I think it could also be like when you're exploring gender as this observer, as opposed to be a participant, you're like, well, if I remain objective, then my answers are more legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. I think sometimes that can be the case, or it's like if you're too invested in the subject, then that could take away from like the process, which is not true, but like talking about the relationship of like, even when you started this project, how people would have viewed, Brene Brown hadn't really broken onto the scene quite.
Right. But yeah, if I had approached people and been like, hello, I'm a non-binary, like blah, 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 like this is my deal. This is what I think gender is. I want to talk to you about what you think gender is. Like that would be a very different like conversation. And I think in some ways it would have been more successful in connecting with some groups of folks that I wanted to and establishing trust to have those conversations. The folks who I interviewed all showed an immense amount of like, they gave me this wonderful gift of their time, like, an hour to 3 hours of sitting down and chatting about what is a very vulnerable topic with someone who, for most of these people, I was basically a stranger. And, I'm also thinking about like the concept of objectivity. And I do want to like bring in that is still like something that brought a lot of value to my interviews, and is something that I, even in the last interviews that I did in 2016, I really I still tried to hold that space of like, I'm here to like listen to what this other person is sharing and like receive that gift and like not make it like about me, or not necessarily like try to turn it into like a back and forth. Like, I think I evolved a lot as an interviewer, but even then, like, I think I would say that by that point, I was able to like, see where it was valuable and like important to like kind of step back, not necessarily be objective, I guess, but step back and listen, rather than like necessarily be like, here's my agenda, like right off the bat, because like people shared things with me like that were really surprising and challenging, and I love that, and that's something that I really benefited from with the book. Sorry to talk over you there, but yeah.
Oh no, yeah. People want to hear you talk now. No, I love that. I love that idea that like, even like exactly as you said, objectivity of some sort does have a lot of value, where you want to come in as open as you can be, because it's like you can't necessarily predict what somebody's going to be saying, and you don't know how you're going to respond to things you don't know are about to come at you, especially with something while you were in your own moment of being like vulnerable and figuring things out, and it's something that resonates with you. And it's mentioned throughout the book where it's like the minute something is defined or a label is like used, there's whether it's the person themselves who brought it up, or like other people you may have interviewed, and it was immediately challenged. And I think that's just a really interesting aspect of a lot of things, like identity politics in general, but like for the LGBTQ plus community, that especially becomes like a huge thing, especially as we see like this broadening of like trying to find as many words as we possibly can to like define things. And I love hearing the acknowledgement that like definitions are immediately challenged. And I think that is something that's really essential to, it's tricky and challenging, but really essential to like the LGBTQ plus community in our history, is that we have, whether we feel like it's been going on or not, we have been having the same conversations for decades. Y'all, we really have. Like, it has always come down to like how we, whether we want to fit into boxes or if we don't want to fit into boxes, and what that means, you know. So,
or if we want to like have the boxes and then set them up in like a like pillow fort-esque construction and like go from box to box.
Yes, we love a good pillow fort, a little blanket fort. Shout out to any of my Our Flag Means Death friends who may or may not be attending. Good blanket fort, it's a comfort area. But yeah, like those boxes, they have they have meaning. I think it's a great place to ground ourselves sometimes, but I think there's just always, we are always going to see challenges to those boxes. We're always going to see expansion and contraction to those boxes. And, you know, I think it's lovely to hear you, especially having gone through such an exhaustive process of like creating this really immense and vulnerable body of work, whether it had concluded in a book or not, like however this project ended up living, like you remaining open even after this huge amount of time, like is just a testament to yourself. And I think is really a part of like what I hope we can all embrace as a queer spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think there's a real power. There's a power in the box, and there's a power in getting out of the box. And, you know, one of the things that I love about the queer community is that at its finest, like it is a bunch of people like playing with that power and having fun. And like using that power to like to help people out, which I think is great. So
yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of things that we can always benefit. And one thing I also really love about your book, because I think, not to go too long, I want to respect everyone's time, but I love this conversation. I just want to say, like, one thing that I think is really crucial about your book is the multi-generational possible, because I do think that it continues to be a challenge for a lot of us, whether it's in a queer space or if it's in just other types of communities we may find ourselves in. We may not always have access to people who are older than us, may feel certain ways, or, you know, like I'm in my 30s, so like kids, like folks younger than myself. And I do think, again, if we're just talking about like crucial relationships or just crucial aspects to hold on to within the LGBTQ plus community, it's definitely intergenerational relationships. And I think there's some, you know, I don't know. If I base things on how I view things online, that's like such a sliver of the real thing. But I think it's really hard to find like elders to be in relationship with, you know, getting to know them, getting to hear their stories. And I just appreciate that that's part of like what your book brings, is a range of people.
Thank you. Yeah, and
crucial.
I would definitely, that was something that was important to me, like when I first realized I wanted to have like a list of demographics to reach out to, like age was a big part of that. And I think, you know, within the queer community, like connecting intergenerationally is really difficult. And I think that there's like a few reasons behind that. Like one is the fact that, like, you know, as queer folks, we're often born to straight people, like, right? Like not always, but like usually that's the case. So like, you know, our process of like growing up and getting to know ourselves is about like going out and connecting with folks maybe outside of our family or like community of origin. Not always true, but you know, as a general thrust. The other thing is, of course, like the AIDS epidemic really devastated our community and our ability. Like there are so many voices who, you know, we would still like be able to speak to and like hear their stories today. Like they're, you know, like there are relatives that like that I've lost. There's, you know, that there's this gap, and because that is not taught in public schools, or like a lot of people don't have access to that history, like there's kind of this lack of awareness of like why there is that void. And then the other thing is a deliberate attempt to isolate us from one another, particularly to isolate young people from their communities. And of course, we see that with legislation. We see that in discourse, like talking about how a queer person even existing makes them like a groomer or like whatever. Like these are all like really, really insidious, not only for like kind of the obvious, like you're interfering with a person's ability to live their life, but they're insidious like in the same way, tying it back to landscape, you know, like garlic mustard is insidious, right? Because it doesn't just shade everything out, it like poisons the ground. So like all of these connections that the native plants rely on through mycorrhizal fungi, like it kills that. So they don't have those connections anymore. And so they don't have the resources that they need, and they die. Like even when the garlic mustard is long gone. And I see that in like, again, in online spaces, especially, you know, where young people talking about like feeling creeped out, or like, oh, like, why would you talk to me if you're like, you know, over a certain age? And it's like, okay, well, some of those are valid concerns. And there's also like this bigger, like insidious thing that has like, it is a poison that has like gotten into people's heads and are now like bringing into the space. Anyway, sorry, I have like a whole rant about that, but I am very glad to include elder stories in our book. They're so valuable and so important. So
yeah, I hear a lot what you're saying, picking up what you're putting down. So and yeah, it's a big conversation that, you know, not just two presumably 30-something white queers should be having. So, but I'm glad, like, again, it's just wonderful to see in your book. So on that note, I feel like it's maybe, you know, we kind of had that like lovely little adrenaline of like, a rant that I could go on, but I won't. Let's go into our book conversations, because I really loved your picks, and I think we'll be able to pull up slides.
While I'm pulling up those slides, a quick question that I kind of pulled from discourse in the chat, but if you could pick a favorite person to just highlight for those who haven't read the book yet, could you briefly like pick a quick person from your book to talk about while I pull the slides up, and then I will be quiet for a second.
I mean, the person who immediately comes to mind is Paris's interview. Paris is the one, am I allowed to swear on this?
Go for it.
Who, you know, Paris is self-described as a boss-ass bitch.
Yes.
It's the best answer I've gotten to, can you describe your gender identity for me? It's like, what pronouns, like how, like, how's your body, hormones, that does not matter. What matters is being a boss-ass bitch. And, you know, that interview, like, I, you know, would never have heard or connected with that like any other place, I feel like, than like, you know, in this interview setting with the Shiva group. And I love it. And I learned like that, it's one of those like phrases that just changed my life from then on. So, and, you know, Paris was also super vulnerable with me about like talking about struggles and like, you know, history of like the, particularly the African-American trans community in Milwaukee. And it's just really phenomenal. I'm so grateful that I got to do that, Shad.
Awesome. And you can read more about Paris in the book. So I definitely recommend everybody checks it out. We'll include the link to buy and put on hold at the library when we follow up with everyone.
It's page 76.
Mark it down.
Anyone really wants to jump over to Paris.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So when we asked Rhea what you would like to talk about this evening, these are the books. So we're just going to all quick run through our recommendations. So go ahead.
All right. I had to like stare at my bookshelf a lot to like narrow it down to 3. But A Quick and Easy Guide to Queer and Trans Identities is this beautiful little like pocket-sized quick guide. It is delightful. It's funny. There are snails, which, you know, since I've got like, you know, the gender and nature nerd thing going on, I'm like, yes, this is beautiful. And the art style is just like really like it has the like, this is the book that back when I was searching like for little diagrams of like what is gender and how does it work, like finding something like this, like maybe my book wouldn't exist if I had found it, but also that would have made my life a lot easier in terms of like understanding myself and connecting. So that one is a delight. I definitely recommend it as like a charming, like relatively quick read. And the next book on my recommendation is Gender, a Graphic Guide by Meg John Barker and Jewel Scheel. The same author illustrator pairing also did a book called Queer, a Graphic History, which I also really recommend. And really helped me understand like where some of the conversations that I was seeing and still see in the LGBTQ community, where they're coming from and what their history is. So recommend that one as well. Gender, a Graphic Guide. When this book came out, I panicked. I called my agent, I called my editor. I was like, listen, this is the book that I wanted to write in 2012 and I didn't have the qualifications for, and now it's out and it's beautiful and someone better than me did it already. And I don't know, this whole, maybe we don't need this. And then the book actually came out and I read it and I love it. And this has, so Meg John Barker has the academic chops to like really explore gender with a solid grounding in like the work that's been done in academia about gender already. Like my Fine is like very much lived experiences and oral history. You know, I'm coming from a place where I don't have that academic background. So it's a very different tale. And so like, if there is a book that I could pair with Fine, it would be this one, because then you can hear this lived experiences and also like read about what is happening with gender theory today on an academic level and where that comes from. And so it's a fantastic book. My last one is Let's Talk About It by Erica Moen and Matthew Nolan. Teens Guide to Sex, Relationships, and Being a Human. A big theme of my book is like having conversations and talking about things that are both very close to us and very vulnerable and also like somewhat taboo. And this book, while not focused on gender, it's, you know, sex, relationships, also gender is included in there. It's just really wonderful. And, you know, I think the highest recommendation I can give it is that my spouse and I were in the process of becoming parents, and my spouse read this book and, you know, closed it and looked at me and was like, we have to keep this because I want our child 16 years from now to have this book to look at. Like, this is phenomenal. So definitely recommend that. And I just love the title. Let's talk about it, you know? Yeah.
And I love, at least in our libraries, it is in the YA collections.
Yes.
So I really love and appreciate that and also like if anyone gets a chance to look at it, it has just a beautiful array of like bodies that are a part of it, and, you know, of all abilities, all sizes. And it's just one of those lovely, effortless, but very thoughtful books. So I was very excited to see it on your list.
Those are awesome picks. Yeah, I put all of them on hold when you sent them through. I was like, and I mean, I had we have the quick and easy guide at Ease, my library branch, and I was immediately drawn to it by the size, because it is, as you said, like this little, you put it in your back pocket. It's super cute, and like those kind of psychedelic graphics just really like make you want to reach out and pick it up off the shelf.
Well, and that's so valuable with like when talking about like gender and queer and trans experiences in general, is that there's an accessibility barrier, and like, so breaking that by either like being a pocket guide or being a graphic novel, or like, you know, like it is really powerful. Like there are folks, you know, friends, my in-laws, like there are people who, like, if I had written like a dense like academic like book, prose book about gender, like I would never have gotten them to read it. But because I did it as a graphic novel, they're like, yeah, sure, I'll read this. Whoa, okay, cool. Like anyway, all right, more recommendations.
Yay, love it. Okay, next slide is Tanya's.
So speaking of the AIDS crisis and epidemic, so my first book I'm going to recommend, it's a I believe 2022 book. It was vulgar and it was beautiful how AIDS activists used art to fight a pandemic by Jack Lowry. And I will say I primarily read my stuff via audiobook. We unfortunately, at least in the MPL, the Milwaukee Public Library system, don't have this as an audiobook, but we do have it as a physical copy, and hopefully we can always get an audiobook version of it. I'm currently listening to it, and the thing I love about this book is it's about Grand Fury, so that's GRAN space FURY, and it was a group of gay men who primarily had marketing backgrounds who started to create art somewhat in connection with like ACT UP, who was the predominant like AIDS activist during the beginning and height of the crisis. So if you've ever seen the inverted pink triangle with silence equals death, if you've ever seen the neon green, like lizard looking Ronald Reagan picture that says AIDS Gate, if you've ever seen the archive photo of two sailors kissing, and I forget what the tagline is, like if you've ever seen any of those, you have seen Grand Fury's work, and they are absolutely the like crucial visual voice to the AIDS crisis. And I really appreciate you mentioning the AIDS epidemic. I'm referring to it as an epidemic, at least within the like United States context. Obviously, it continues to be a pandemic in our global community. But I am a huge AIDS history is a very big part of like what I take away from the queer community. And I think a lot about like the amount of ancestors I've lost because of it. And Grand Fury in particular, as a visual artist myself, I just appreciate the like story behind how these people came together and decided to like make impactful images that continue to be used to this day and recognizable to this day. And I think AIDS history should be taught in all schools. I think if AIDS history was a part of our general curriculum, we would have a better sort of like understanding of how the government handled our most recent and ongoing pandemic. There would have been a lot of context for that. And I think the other thing that's really great about this book is just talking about how art can be a voice for communicating necessary information that has really been lost at this time. So anyway, clearly lots of feelings about that. It was vulgar and it was beautiful by Jack Lowry. And that has a lot of interviews from the original Grand Jury members. And then moving on, this is also a non-fiction book called The Pink Line, Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers by Mark Gabisser. This is available on Hoopla Digital so using your MPL library card and as an audiobook. And I really appreciate this and feel like it ties into your work, Rhea, because it is, this was also a man who has like traveled everywhere to like interview people. And I think thinking about how you mentioned like there's voices that you know aren't included in this. And although it's not exclusively about gender, it's talking about, you know, our like the queer lives basically of the 21st century and throughout different countries and parts of the world. And I've been very captivated by that. And then just for the sake of something that isn't a heavy nonfiction book, and in relation to gender, I wanted to recommend Melissa by Gino, another past author guest we have had. They are fantastic. Melissa is the new re-release of a book that was previously published as George, but Melissa is the true name of the character in talks about that. And now we've got this brand new cover for Melissa's story, and I highly recommend. It's a middle grade book, and it's perfect both for kids of that age, as well as, like, I really appreciated it as an adult, as well as the follow-up to the book called this book called Rick, that Alex writes very wonderful examples of how to perhaps like grow as an adult. I appreciated that there's moments throughout both Melissa and Rick where adults are like hold themselves accountable to kids. And I think it's always great to be reminded that that's important for us to do as adults, is to know how to hold ourselves accountable to the youth in our lives and how to apologize if we get something wrong. And, if gender is a new thing you're undertaking or like broadening your scope of gender, it's likely we'll get a lot of things wrong. And it's just really useful to like see how easy it is to be accountable and compassionate. So those are my picks.
All right, and then I am next. So I picked two graphic novels that are both fairly recently published, and number one, they drew me in because of the cover art. That's how I work. So I definitely was attracted to these on the cover. The first one is called Flung Out of Space by Grace Ellis and Hannah Templar. And this is a historical fiction take on the historic figure and author, Patricia Highsmith, who wrote The Price of Salt, which is kind of a seminal lesbian text. And so this is the author's take on the life through her point of view, but in a fictionalized way. So it's kind of like reading a historical fiction book off the shelf about like Anne Boleyn or something like that. So I thought that was really a cool concept and not something I had necessarily seen before in a graphic novel. So definitely gorgeous to look at. And I was really interested in learning more about the author and her life through what they imagine her point of view might be. And then my last one is Queer as All Get Out by Shelby Criswell. This one is shelved in our young adult section as well, but I found it very approachable for both teens and grown-ups. And this is, you follow the daily life of a queer artist who lives in Texas. And then as they're going about their life and day, they talk about folks who inspired them throughout history. So kind of connecting to the queer people from the past and bringing it into their daily life. The illustrations, again, are super fun. And it kind of reminded me, my kid likes to read that Rebel Girls book where it highlights like a particular person in like a short couple paragraphs. So this reminded me a little bit of that one, but more in a comic book form, along with the more personal narrative. And it reminded me of your book a little bit too, Rhea. So it was really nice. And I definitely recommend you pick both of these up. All right. And then that is all we have for book recommendations, but I just want to go through a couple library related things before we ask any questions that you might have and wrap up for this evening. I want to again encourage everyone to sign up for our adult summer reading program. You can win great prizes from local businesses just by logging 5 books. You still have until the end of August, so there's plenty of time to read. Maybe you can check out one of the books we recommended this evening. You can do that tonight just by signing up on our website. And then if you do so, you can check and see if one of our branches still has your free book coupon for our used book cart sales. Super fun.
And I'll just say really quick, if you don't happen to live in Milwaukee, I can see if your local public library has a summer reading program for adults or any age. And if they don't happen to have one specific to adults, suggest perhaps they should.
Ask. Right to your library
board. We love
board.
hearing what people actually want us to do.
Absolutely. All right. And then not technically a book chat, but next month, I'm so happy to be hosting author Emily Sullivan, who is releasing the 3rd book in her League of Scoundrels series. It's called The Hellion and the Hero. We're celebrating Read a Romance Month and her new book. If you like Persuasion by Jane Austen, this definitely has elements of that and just a little bit of a more modern tone. So she's a wonderful author, and I hope you join us. We'll put the registration link in our follow-up email. That's on August 23rd at 6 p.m. And then throughout the month of July, you can visit our Mitchell Street branch, which I very much encourage you to do. It's been recently renovated. It's a gorgeous building, and they're celebrating Arab American culture and heritage on Monday, July 18th and Saturday, July 23rd at the hours listed. There'll be story times, music, fashion shows, calligraphy, button making, food, and ice cream. So definitely come on in and check that out. And that's all I got for slides. Let me put those down. And then, yeah, let me just check our chat here. There's a couple more recommendations folks made, including a book called Queer Nature, which is a poetry anthology. So if you were kind of inspired by our discussion tonight, that might be one to check out. And then let's see. No other questions that I can see. Do we have any final thoughts for our special guest, Tanya?
No, I just want to say thank you so much for spending time with us and, sharing so much of your perspective on where this book came from and a little hint of what's next.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been super awesome. And y'all have asked like really fantastic questions that have gotten me all fired up. So
awesome. Where can everyone keep track of you, follow along with what you have coming up next?
I am on Twitter at FineComic. I'm on Instagram at Rhea.Ewing. And I'm also on Pillow Fort, if you're on that website, at Rhea-Ewing, I think. So yeah, and I don't update super often. It's still difficult for me to talk about myself on the regular, but I'm working on it. And that is definitely where I'll be posting updates about future projects. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much for being here, and thanks to all of our audience members as well.
Thank you, everybody.
Milwaukee Public Library appreciates you and your time, and we'll see you sometime soon. Okay, keep in touch.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.